So.
Good afternoon, everyone. If I start speaking too fast, please tell me to slow down. When I first received the brief for this talk, working in modern hospitals, as I do these days, I was quite dubious as to what I could really bring to this, because I didn't see any of this going on in modern medicine, to be honest. I was aware of many of the innovations along the lines of imaging and machinery that we use on a day-to-day basis, which you could stretch to the point that this is perhaps Deva-inspired. And we will look at some of the things that modern medicine is doing. Some of it's quite wondrous. But what really struck me was that my initial thoughts were, what's the evidence for that we're being instructed by these violet devas in medicine to try and bring in these new forms of healing? So I took a broad view and went back really to the mid to late 1800s. And it's not a surprise that that's actually the period of time when the likes of Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society and spiritualism really got a major impulse. And I think one of the things that we've talked about this between ourselves, Lawrence, and I think we drew from this, forgetting the detail, that something happened at that time, which then was lost, probably for good reason, that we can't necessarily explain at the moment, and that something is going to happen again. So I'd like to really kind of go into that and provide some evidence for that. I find it quite inspiring, despite the fact that in modern medicine now it's quite difficult to make a case for some of the things that's written here about the violet devas. There is certainly evidence going back in time. So I want to broaden the idea of the violet light to not just violet light or ultraviolet light, but we will touch upon that. I want us to think more about the seventh ray, really, which essentially is that is the violet light. In the spectrum, the seventh ray is the violet light. It's the pure violet. So think of it in terms of what's the symbolism behind some of the inventions that have occurred since going back to the 1800s. The evidence that this is evidence that something else is going to come along later, and this is the symbol of it. So going back to the 1800s, I've mentioned spiritualism, the Theosophical Society. It was a period of real innovation in medicine and science. And interestingly enough, I had a thought earlier on this afternoon that a lot of these innovations occurred in America. Some in the United Kingdom, some in London, but a lot of it was in America, and it struck me that America, if I remember rightly, correct me if I am wrong, but America has a second-ray soul, if I remember rightly, and a seventh-ray personality. Is that 6? I'm completely wrong then. Forget that one. So, if we go back to the main thrust of this, in 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. At the time, it was amazing. People were seeing into people's bodies. I mean, this is something that today would be just utterly miraculous. And I think that X-rays in themselves are a great symbol of the idea of the etheric vision, for example. And Max Heindel, a Rosicrucian occultist, actually talks about X-rays in those terms, that with etheric vision, it's said that we can see through objects, but see the interior of them, beyond them. The solid doesn't actually limit the vision. And that's essentially what X-rays do to a large extent. Our capacity to image the human body has moved on a long way since then, with MRI scanners, CT scanners, nuclear medicine now. We can talk about those afterwards. But nevertheless, I think that was a real impulse. And at the same time, 1874, osteopathy was inaugurated in America. This is interesting. I'm going to add chiropractic to that as well, because the two halves of one whole, as the Tibetan mentions. These were very, very inspired forms of medical treatment that thought they could go it alone in medicine. and almost completely dispense with drug medicine. Obviously, that's not worked out that way, but nevertheless, they brought some interesting ideas. And it's been mentioned by certain occultists that osteopathy and chiropractic were the beginning efforts to try and make the medical professions recognize the fact of the centers, the chakras, if you want to call them that, the junctional areas of the spine, which chiropractors and osteopaths are very, very interested in, correspond to these centers. That probably hasn't fulfilled the way it was meant to go. However, there are still branches of this, craniosacral therapy, cranial osteopathy, that are delving into very interesting areas that even the practitioners themselves are not really able to grasp what it is. Personally, I have an idea that this is really touching upon the etheric body and the involuntary movement that can be felt beyond the physical, because this work can be done off the physical, even though the mainline therapists would never admit that in public. So these are interesting ideas. This all happened at the same time. At the same time, mesmerism and animal magnetism had a renaissance, particularly in America and in London. Things were going quite well with that until ether anesthetics arrived, and then all of a sudden, the idea of animal magnetism, the fact that human beings themselves were providing a fluidic drug, if you like, to people around them.
Is it a coincidence that they are both called the ether?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure. It's something that I've thought about before. Ether anesthetics it may link to the fact that ether in the late 1800s, we will discuss this in terms of science. It was a very hot topic. The etheric, the fact of the etheric matter was very, very prominent in science, and probably the fact that ether was this nebulous stuff that could put people to sleep may have had, I'm speculating, may have had something to do with that. With the introduction of anesthetics, mesmerism had gone down this road.
What's the difference between mesmerism and hypnotism?
Okay, that's a very, very difficult question to answer, and it might upset a lot of people as well. Helena Blavatsky provides an exceptionally good and detailed description of what the difference is in her collected writings. Essentially, the will remains intact in mesmerism, whereas in hypnotism it's said that the will is stunned, and therefore the soul, it's against the spiritual law to allow yourself to become under the power of another in that way.
I think that's a good enough response. It's perfectly clear that you're not interfering with the will of the patient. Yeah, sure.
That's interesting and difficult to actually to work out the difference when you get into some of the later mesmerism, where particularly the Marquis of Pusiger, who was one of the disciples of Mesmer, who took it even further and developed somnambulism, which was this ability to tap into some real higher clairvoyant and super conscious aspects of people. Because in those situations, these people are in a trance-like mode. Nevertheless, it's still maintained by occultists that there is a big difference along those lines.
And people were having operations, were they, under the influence of mesmerism?
Absolutely, and in fact, before the ether anesthetics were discovered and disseminated, in India, James Esdale was doing some fantastic work and performing all kinds of surgical operations, built up a rather large documentation of this. There was another gentleman, a very, very prominent physician in London, Elliotson, who brought the stethoscope to the UK, actually. He was very, very well renowned in London, and he staked his whole career on mesmerism and animal magnetism. Unfortunately, it didn't go very well for him, and he ended up being utterly destitute at the end.
But along with that, more specifically to our conversation as well, is the two people that I know you're interested in who are actually experimenting with blue light, blue and red light, in strengthening health and vitality. Yeah.
So I think the thing to take from the 1800s is essentially this idea that, personally, I think that there was a strong seventh ray impulse at that time, which brought with it all of these very, very there was a gentleman called Dr. Seth Pankhurst, and I'm going to talk a lot about blue light, but back in those days, they tended to lump together blue, purple, and violet. So I don't want you to just get caught, well, he's talking about violet light. Actually, we're talking about the same thing, and they tended to be just described as blue light. Seth Pankhurst was a medical doctor at the time, and in 1877 wrote an interesting book called The Red and Blue Light and Its Uses in Medicine. It was actually an excuse to write a book about the Kabbalah, very, very interesting. But he gave some interesting ideas about what light was, the spectrum of light, and completely turned on the head this idea, certainly now, of what light really is. So he discussed the idea of the particle theory of light, and in his day, it had just been decided that that was no longer really tenable, and that the wave idea of light was where they were all going. But he wasn't happy with that either, and decided that waves that clash, even of different wavelengths, would interfere with each other. And he proposed an idea that was called the impulse and tension theory. And he spoke very openly about the ether and how light would propel itself along an ether wire and tension that wire until it got to where it was at 186,000 miles a second. I think what's most interesting about his work is that he tells us that at that time, science was very much happy with the idea of ether, and that they accepted pretty much across the board that it was the only reasonable explanation for what was going on with phenomena. And I know that we want to perhaps explore that a little bit more afterwards about what happened to that idea. So Seth Pankhurst was a medical doctor who was interested in using these lights in healing. And he tells us in the book that he cured many, many people, and that his colleagues were curing lots of people. From my perspective as a modern doctor, scientist, it's not particularly helpful because he doesn't really tell us about them, and he doesn't tell us really how he did it. He just talks in broad terms about using red light for calming the nervous system down and blue light for stimulating the nervous system when it was depleted. He talked about curing sciaticas within 20 minutes of applying these lights and things like that, which I'm sure that most people these days would be very grateful of, but we've obviously lost the thread of that along the way, if in fact it did actually work. His work was partly based on the Kabbalah and what he understood about the Kabbalah, but he also tapped into some work by a gentleman called Augustus Pleasanton, who Helena Blavatsky talks about quite a bit. And she uses him to explain that the value of violet light in health and in agriculture is proven. As far as she was concerned, his work had proven this. So just to tell you a little bit about him, he was a late 1800s again in Philadelphia in America. He had this, he was a very interesting guy, obviously very intuitive, had this idea that the blue of the sky had some basis for the growth of vegetables. So he started to look into this idea, well, how could I use light to maybe influence that? Now, many quite prominent scientists had worked with pure light, spectral light, and used prisms to divide light up, and had tried to apply this light in specific circumstances for both healing and for use in agriculture, and had got nowhere with this. But I think the genius of Pleasanton was that he combined specific lights with natural light. So he didn't emit any of the rays. In the same way as, why would you just feed somebody vitamin C to see what vitamin C did? Of course, they would die of other deficiencies. So that was his genius. All these great scientists had tried this work and just didn't get the fact that we need the whole spectrum of light. But he augmented the blue-violet light. And he built a big greenhouse. Essentially, it was a big greenhouse. Took, I think, maybe 2 years to build. And he replaced, he kind of experimented for a while, and he found that for vegetables, and particularly he was a grape grower, growing grapes, he found that a ratio of 1 blue-violet pane to 8 of natural light was the optimum for agriculture. He also then went across into animal husbandry as well, and also healing, human healing. And he found that the ratio for these, for animal life, was a 1-to-1 ratio. It got the best results. So 1 blue pain to white light of 1. So just to give you an idea of what happened at that time, within the first year of growing these grapes, and this really is to show you the value of this violet blue light and what it could potentially do, although we seem to have lost the thread, is that the comparative vines that were being grown by other people in the area that had been provided by the same seller from the same origin, their vines in the first year grew, I think it was 5 feet. Well, Pleasanton's grew 45 feet. And he relates the fact that in Italy, where many people were growing grapes, it took 6 years to get the first yield of grapes. It took time to build up that, for the sensitivity to build up to actually produce grapes. And we find that in many fruit-bearing plants. Pleasanton, in his first year, produced in his greenhouse almost 2 tons of grapes. And they were enormous, absolutely enormous, these grapes, with no loss to taste at all, which is important to mention because these days we have larger vegetables that often don't taste as they should do because we're growing them in ways which are abnormal, perhaps. In his second year, he produced well over 2 tons. So lots of people he presented to the Agriculture Society this work, and lots of other people went off and started doing similar things. And it started what was known at the time, very, very popular. It was called the blue glass craze, and people were building these greenhouses and growing vegetables with blue light. By the way, he was treating pigs with this light and producing enormous animals very, very quickly. He was producing bulls within 14 months to the maturity that it was taking others many years to do. Other people, medical men, although he was always disappointed that the medical profession didn't take it up as seriously as he thought they should do. But many medical men wrote to him to say that we've taken this work and we've applied it. And it seemed to work very well with debility. So people that were just generally debilitated, they found that time with the blue light, even as little as maybe 20, 30 minutes a day, for a period of a few days, would massively increase the vitality of these people, which is really what the Tibetan was saying about the violet ray affecting the etheric vehicle and stimulating the vitality, if you like. Apparently sciaticas were cured within 20 minutes of exposure to these lights. People were literally replacing window panes in their houses with blue panes and allowing it to basically impact upon their vehicle.
So we've got all this wonderful experimentation taking place, and in line with what the Tibetan says, when the violet devas return, with the reappearance of the Christ, it will be the efficiency of violet light in lessening human ills. They will demonstrate the superconsciousness world, that it exists, teach humanity how rightly to feed the human body by drawing nourishment from the surrounding ethers, all that kind of stimulation of the vegetables, and that seems to fit in with that. But something sort of changed around that time, and it was predicted, Blavatsky could see it coming, and this is what she said. The knowledge of the real nature of the ether, or the akasha, and other mysteries, in short, can alone lead to the knowledge of forces. It is that substance against which the materialist school of the physicists rebels with such fury, and which exact science has to advocate notwithstanding. They cannot make away with the ether without incurring the risk, like a modern Samson, of pulling down the pillars of the temple of science and getting buried under its roof. Then in 1919, it was around that time that Einstein's theory of relativity, of general relativity, was starting to grow, and it was argued against by people like Tesla, and specifically those who were in the TS, like Oliver Lodge, who was one of the people who was involved in the discovery of radio, although he got no credit for it, along with Tesla and Marconi, of course. But it came to a head around the time when there was a general eclipse, And Arthur Eddington, another famous scientist, who went somewhere down to the west coast of America, an island off Africa, and took photographs of the eclipse, and then came back and compared them with the night sky when there is no eclipse. And through it, there was the observation of gravity bending light. And so the whole idea of general relativity and space-time won the day then. And the ether was disbanded with as having anything to do with science. And while general relativity, had its, Einstein's work all led to the wonderful idea of energy and mass being interconvertible, a different journey was taken then, and there was a loss of the ether, and so experimentation seemed to die out at that point. And as we've discovered, the seventh ray in its lower aspect, because Einstein's theory is relativity, so it encloses you within a system because everything's relative to something else, so it doesn't allow you to move into the ether and higher levels of consciousness. So at that point, the ether was disbanded with, and the experimentation started to go in the way of the lower aspect of the seventh ray, which is about standardization and regimentation.
Absolutely, and in fact the Tibetan says that the only way forward for medicine to make any major strides now is to recognize the etheric body. In my experience, through medical school, through medical training, there is no sight of it at all. Yes, medicine recognizes that we are essentially an electric vehicle, but it hasn't really gone beyond that at the moment. So just that idea that the only way it can make strides is to recognize this. That's not to deny that in modern medicine we've done some wonderful, wonderful things, and some of the technology out there and the disease burden that now is cured or at least ameliorated by the methods that we have and the knowledge that we have is really astounding. But I just wonder, having looked at this, developed this talk, if you like, I can see that, wow, what could have been if we'd have followed the line of the ether. And it was just that moment where everything seemed to just fall off a cliff, whether it be Pleasanton's idea, whether it be the mesmerism due to the discovery of ether. It all just got dropped at that point.
But all the wonderful machinery we've got still works on the principle of the seventh ray of organisational. Starting when the seventh ray came in the 1780s, in the Industrial Revolution, every machine is performing ceremonial order in the way that it shunts backwards and forwards, up and down. And the machines that we have today are all working on that lower aspect of it, but the healing is confined within the world of effects.
And it's all working through electricity as well. It might not be in the way that we envisage it in terms of working directly on the body with electrical impulses, but nevertheless, all the machinery uses. I mean, if you go into any modern hospital now, wherever you look, there's a plug socket and a machine plugged into it. That's the way it is. So all of this ties in. We're certainly receiving the seventh ray, but it's how it's applied. And I think the other thing that I wanted to bring out of this was that in modern medicine, standardization is where everything has gone. There's a good reason for that, and I respect the reason why that's happening, because certainly in recent memory, we've had some fairly problematic events with Shipman and the likes, and it's kind of got medicine to think about, well, how do we bring everybody up to an adequate level? And that's commendable, but at the same time, this standardization and crystallization, meaning that you would get the same treatment here as you would in an office in New York, it's all very good, but it stifles innovation. There is no way you could have a Seth Pancoast these days or an Anton Mesmer going around doing his stuff. You couldn't do it. And that makes me quite sad, actually. There are things that I'm interested in doing and pursuing, but I would have to be very careful about how I did that, and it couldn't be done in a mainstream fashion. So this standardization it's almost as if it's, because we're not at the level where we can apply the seventh ray in its higher aspects, we are still applying it, but in the lower standardizing, crystallizing format, which is a problem. That's applying in teaching as well. Teaching has become standardized, where the ability of teachers to be able to teach to inspire, as is disappearing, and people are leaving the profession, both medical and teaching, in droves because they don't get any joy from the job anymore. It will change, and it may be driven by the fact that people are not prepared to work under those circumstances.
But as we saw as talking with Jim yesterday, that there are many things that are on the horizon, and when the ether does open up, then there's going to, I would imagine, be some kind of transformation. But so the point where we're at now is, I mean, there are many forms of alternative medicines and practices. I know that compared to the masses who go to use the NHS in this, it's a small amount. But how do you see now us moving into the future in the next, the next 10 years, for instance? There are certain practices that you think will catch on that involve the strengthening effect of the violet devas?
So I think that the Tibetan talks a lot about how we can vitalize the etheric body, because if you vitalize the etheric body, you get automatically health of the physical, to the point where it can become automatic. If we know how to live correctly, to avoid those which deplete and to encourage those which vitalize. And this is he talks about this in very simple terms, and I think this is appropriate. He talks about appropriate air quality. He talks about sanitation. He talks about eating the right food. We have to be careful about the diet aspect, because people can focus on this, particularly from an esoteric school kind of angle. You know, diet's a small part of a very, very big picture, particularly when it comes to health. Public health medicine and sanitation in general has probably been responsible for most of the health gains that we have had over the last 150 years. Modern medicine has come a long way. We've got antibiotics, saves lots of lives, but actually in comparison to having clean water, relatively clean air, that's where the real innovation is. And I think that on a societal level, that will go further. Already we see that people are very interested in air quality, and you know, we're applying policy and politics to try and change that.
Doesn't that fit in with what Jim was saying yesterday about Orbs? They seem to be attracted to a certain type of people, particularly children. And there you have presumably not teenagers, unless they've been brought up well. But, you know, the purity of children in that attracts them, and it shows that people are more susceptible and are interested in alternative medicine are the people who are going to resonate with these healing devas.
Absolutely, and something I wanted to bring out perhaps with the future aspect is that devas are thought sensitive. And Jim, I think you mentioned that, didn't you, this idea. So the Tibetan talks a lot about the idea that the new forms of healing, and the ones that we're perhaps familiar with in terms of imagining organs that are well, and actually once you start to imagine these structures, and this is pure magic that we're talking about here, and the stages of applying that are obviously a long way down the line, but the idea that a physician could almost, or a healing group, which is probably most appropriate, could imagine organs that are well, and then the devas respond to that. I know that we've talked about Levin's work, and Jim, I know you're familiar with Levin's work.
This is the bioelectric code and the research into morphogenesis.
So Michael Levin has obviously tapped into this idea of bioelectrics and how the field of electricity determines the morphology of organisms. Certainly when I was at medical school a good few years ago, we were taught this in embryology, which looking back was quite advanced really. That it was the electricity that determined where the cells went to in embryogenesis. His ideas are that he can manipulate cellular structures by blocking protein channels with neurotoxins, even with light, and certain drugs that we wouldn't normally associate with that. It was just found that he's able to block these channels, which means that it changes the polarity around those cells, which means that all of a sudden they're sending different electrical signals. So he's certainly on the verge perhaps of being able to grow. He certainly has produced extra limbs and heads on frogs which cannot ordinarily do that. There are some animals that can do that naturally. I think you mentioned something. Yeah, it's already been done.
So what does it mean though when through hard science and experimental evidence that it's proved that there is a bioelectric code that stands behind DNA?
So my thoughts on this are that He's using chemicals to make the... So it's almost in like a transition world between using electricity in its purest form and using chemicals, which is really in our standard materialistic world of viewing things. He's starting to cross that boundary. But surely later, we will be able to find that we can influence that electric field through thought. And it's this idea of Devas. So let's go deeper with this, and let's take the premise that occultism teaches that we create our own reality. So literally everything we see and hear is what we've created ourselves from our own ideas of what the world is. And literally Devas are populating everything around us because that's what we imagine the world is. It's a very interesting concept. If we were to take that literally, then why is it not possible for us through thought to be able to create new limbs?
The whole idea of moving from DNA, which really is a symbol of the form controlling life and the growth of things, to going to a force of electricity, which is a very wild sort of force, to think that electricity in some form is actually controlling the growth of organisms. Surely that means that there must be intelligence or consciousness guiding it in its organizational aspect. And to me, that could be a big breakthrough. And then there is a sort of bridge forming then, because, well, okay, scientists are okay with that. And then we can start moving into the idea of the imagination and how thought can influence electric fields.
Yeah, and we're a long way from that. But actually, much of the magic that's done, from an occult point of view, you don't necessarily need to apply the mind to the nuts and bolts. And the way I would explain this is that one of the problems with modern medicine is regenerative medicine is probably the cutting edge of medicine now. Trying to create organs. We have 3D printing. They literally are printing organs to then place in the human body. There has been some interesting work on that. The jury's still out as to whether that really is possible. We've used stem cell work with bone marrow transplants for many, many years. Nobody's ever really said anything derogatory about that. But when it comes to stem cells creating organs, it gets a little bit more difficult for the ethics. I've completely lost the thread of what I was going to say there. Bear with me. Yeah, so one of the problems with the 3D printing and the stem cells is, and the thing that the scientists have stumbled, the point they've stumbled, is that they cannot produce the background vasculature and nerves to make that a viable tissue. So yes, it's possible to create an organ that's in the shape of a trachea, a windpipe, for example, using certain techniques. Difficult, but it's possible. But then how do you make that a viable organ by having a blood supply? Because all you've produced is a sheet of cells. Now, Levin's work is very interesting because he grew, it's quite grotesque. It takes us back to the idea of the Lemurian, Atlantean problem where we had animals walking around that were imaginations, basically a product of people's imaginations, which was, half man, half animal, which again ties into this idea that we can create our own reality if you buy into the idea that back in Lemuria, back in Atlantis, all this happened. But essentially, Levin, one of the things that struck me is that in a tadpole, he grew an eye in the gut, and that eye was perfectly functioning. It had all its vasculature and everything else. And it was just simply that he altered the electrical field around it, so it grew in the gut. And so therefore, he's dispensed with the idea that we then need to somehow provide a blood supply to this organ. If you tap into the magic at a certain level, it seems that everything else is taken care of because the Devas themselves have intelligence and are able to complete the process, if that makes sense. So I don't think it's too much of a step at some stage, but it would be helpful if we were able to see etherically. I don't think it's too much of a step to be able to think that thought is able to create these substructures, the substance that the physical can then build around. And in fact, I just wanted to quote the Tibetan, which he says that the entire process of healing is thought-directed. It concerns the direction of energy currents or their abstraction. And this is another way of speaking about magnetism and radiation. I mean, he gives it to us in its entirety there. It's just really finding the context for that. So it's entirely thought-based.
Yeah, and it's another interesting idea is the fact that all the imaging that takes place in science ultimately will come back to thought and our own imagination, which is an image-making faculty. So by working with it to create an image of health is a very strengthening process in itself. So you can see a bridge that's forming scientifically that can lead us into these more what seem like extraordinary ideas, but which may not be so far away. But is there any sort of last concluding thought you want to make?
Just to touch on the imaging side of things, I think that's the biggest symbol of all. I mean, what we can see now, in fact, it's actually made us quite lazy as doctors. We tend to turn to imaging very, very quickly these days. Sometimes for good reason, we just want to get on with the job and find out what's really going on there. And these, whereas before it was expensive to go and order an MRI scan, well, now it's relatively cheap and we just do it. Actually, we dispense with many of our diagnostic methods because we've got the scanner there. That sometimes leads to more problems because we find things we weren't expecting and probably didn't ought to be messing with either. But going back to, if you look back at the first X-ray that was done by Wilhelm Röntgen back in 1895. It's a very grainy X-ray of his wife's hand, I think it was, with a ring on it. You could just make out what was going on. Well, now we have the ability to see just the most minute structures with MRI scanning, and the advancement is just superb. And it's this idea that if that's a symbol of our ability to see etherically, obviously it's going to arrive at some stage. I think that there's very little evidence at the moment for etheric vision, but the Tibetan's quite firm that this is going to happen, and it probably will need a new generation or two who live in better conditions that are permit of a more vitalized etheric vehicle for them to be able to do this.
Well, of course, all the developments that take place in medicine and that, they can only take place as consciousness changes. The consciousness of humanity is what produces the symbols on the physical plane. So the fact that the impulse that was going on in the 1800s and that was withdrawn and it became more of a tapping into the lower aspects of the seventh ray, it will be a sign when we eventually start to move in and make discoveries like etheric vision that humanity's consciousness has moved on and is precipitating that symbolic event. And perhaps one of the, there's a fitness is something that people focus on a lot these days, and but in a sense, is it the right sort of fitness? It isn't a sort of focus on vitality as such. It's more on the rude health of body culture and physical fitness, which can have perhaps even the opposite of effect of making us more focused on the dense physical than on the etheric levels.
I think it's definitely a case of putting the cart before the horse from that side of things. And I think that once the etheric vehicle is recognized, what's accepted as beauty in human structure and function will be very different to what we think it is now, actually.
That's an excellent comment, I think, to make to round that off. So, thank you, Dr. Lee Blackburn.